Mumbai to Hyderabad, 623 kilometers, 4,000 rupees. Trivandrum to Colombo, 357 kilometers, 12,000 rupees. Why does the same Indian wallet double its budget the second a flight crosses a border? Beyond the pricing Wild West, there is a more uncomfortable question we aren't asking. Is the race for cheap domestic tickets actually making our skies more dangerous? Is India's aviation industry slowly killing itself and taking passengers along for the ride? No, seriously. Sit with that question for a moment. Because I'm not talking about turbulence. I'm not talking about delayed flights or cold samosas at 35,000 feet. I'm talking about a structural crisis hiding in plain sight, dressed up as competitive pricing and celebrated as democratizing air travel. Let's unpack this. Grab a coffee. This is going to be a good one. Emirates experience at Indigo prices. The most Indian demand ever made. A sharp observation recently made the rounds on LinkedIn, and it stopped me cold. The Indian domestic traveler essentially wants Singapore Airlines cabin crew, Qatar Airways lounges, and Emirates legroom, but expects to pay what Indigo or SpiceJet charges for a seat that may or may not recline. And honestly, can you blame them? Here's the data that should make every aviation professional choke on their chai. Mumbai to Hyderabad, 623 kilometers, costs you 3,500 rupees to 4,500 rupees on a domestic carrier. Fine. Reasonable. Now take Bengaluru to Colombo, 707 kilometers, barely a greater distance, and suddenly you're looking at 8,500 rupees to 9,500 rupees. More than double. For a longer but comparable hop. Or this one, and this one is wild. Chennai to Trivandrum is 612 kilometers. Ticket, 4,500 rupees to 6,000 rupees. Now Trivandrum to Colombo, just 357 kilometers, literally half the distance, costs 11,000 rupees to 12,000 rupees. The same Indian traveler, the same wallet, the same trip. The moment that flight crosses an international border, their willingness to pay doubles without a second thought. Domestically though, a 50 rupees to 100 rupees difference between an Air India Express and an Indigo flight is enough to trigger a full cost-benefit analysis, 3 browser tabs, and a call to a relative who knows someone at the airline. I wish I was exaggerating. I am not exaggerating. So are razor-thin margins actually cutting the throat of Indian aviation? Here's the question that nobody on a panel discussion wants to answer directly. When your entire business model is built on selling 3,500 rupees seats on routes that carry fuel surcharges, airport development fees, ground handling costs, crew costs, and aircraft lease payments, where exactly does the money come from? It doesn't. Not really. And when the money doesn't come, things start to get optimized. And in aviation, optimized is sometimes a polite word for dangerous. Think about what happens at the MRO end of this equation. Your maintenance, repair and overhaul providers, the ones keeping the actual aircraft airworthy, are squeezed by airlines who can't afford to pay more. Airworks, Air India Engineering Services, Lufthansa Technic's Indian Operations, and GMR Aerotechnic, these are serious, capable organizations. But when airlines are negotiating every rupee of a maintenance contract, when scheduled checks get deferred by a day here and a cycle there, those decisions accumulate. I'm not pointing fingers at specific incidents. I'm pointing at a system that makes cutting corners on the ground the rational economic choice. And that should terrify all of us. The government has a levers problem, and it's using the wrong ones. Here's what I find genuinely fascinating about Indian aviation policy. The government runs the Udan scheme Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagrik, specifically to make flying affordable for more Indians. Genuinely wonderful in intent. And it works, to a degree. Regional connectivity has improved. Smaller airports like Belgaum, Hubli and Hindon are seeing real traffic. The government also caps fares during peak demand, festivals, disasters, election seasons. They'll step in and tell Air India, Indigo, SpiceJet and Akasa Air exactly what they cannot charge. So here's my genuine non-rhetorical question to the Ministry of Civil Aviation and DGCA. If you can cap the ceiling, why won't you set a floor? A minimum base fare. A number below which selling a seat becomes illegal, not to protect airline profits, but to protect the health of the ecosystem that keeps those planes in the air. The EU has frameworks that prevent predatory pricing from destabilizing aviation markets. The US has gone back and forth on this for decades. Mature markets understand that an airline industry destroyed by a race to the bottom doesn't serve passengers. It leaves them with fewer choices, worse service and eventually, fewer carriers. Spoiler, a minimum fare floor is a very hard sell to a voting public that loves cheap flights. But so is explaining why their carrier just got grounded. Big airlines running losses to kill the small ones. And we just allow it? Let's talk about something that gets whispered about at industry events but rarely makes it into print. Why does the structure of Indian aviation functionally encourage larger carriers to run deliberate losses on specific routes, specifically to starve out newer entrants? Because that's the game. A well-capitalized player like Indigo, the largest carrier by market share, operating over 300 aircraft and flying to 85+ destinations globally, can absorb losses on a route for months. A newer entrant like Akasa Air, which only launched in 2022 and is still in the early innings of building its fleet out to 100+ aircraft, cannot match that staying power rupee for rupee. So Akasa announces a new route. A larger player drops fares on that exact route to unsustainable levels. Akasa either bleeds or retreats. Fares quietly normalize. Rinse. Repeat. SpiceJet, currently navigating some very serious financial turbulence, grounded aircraft, maintenance disputes with lessors like SMBC Aviation Capital and Willis Lease Finance, and cash flow challenges that have been extensively reported, is partly a casualty of exactly this dynamic. A carrier that was genuinely competitive at its peak was reduced to crisis by a combination of internal challenges and an external market that never let margins breathe long enough to build real resilience. This isn't free market competition. This is a war of attrition with aircraft. And the passengers lose every single time a carrier folds, routes abandoned, fares spiking, options disappearing. The exact opposite of what competitive aviation is supposed to deliver. Business class, 70 to 80% of profits. Decided by someone who has never sat in one. Okay. This is the part of the conversation where I need you to really pay attention. Business class seats, the pointy end of the aircraft, can contribute 70 to 80% of an airline's total profit. On Air India's international routes, on Indigo's expanding international operation, on any carrier serious about its premium product, those front cabin seats are doing enormous economic heavy lifting for the P&L. So who decides whether your company books them? HR. Or more precisely, a travel desk manager whose annual performance review includes a line item called travel cost savings and absolutely no line item called executive, arrived at the meeting functional and well rested. And so the executive, let's call him Rahul, because there are approximately 4 million Rahuls in Indian corporate life, gets booked on the 5 a.m. BOM to DL. He lands, goes straight to the client meeting, spends the full day in discussions, catches the 8 p.m. back to Mumbai, gets home around 10 to 11 p.m. and has to be at his desk by 10 the next morning. He has just invested 18+ hours in company duties, for which he receives a single day's per diem, a polite well done, and perhaps a LinkedIn post from his CEO about our dedicated team. In the US, there are overtime provisions. In the EU, there are mandatory rest period regulations for business travel. In Germany, many companies are legally required to factor travel time into working hours. British Airways and Lufthansa literally market their business class to corporate buyers on the premise of your executive arrives ready to perform. In India, we call 18-hour travel days hustle. We make reels about it. We put it on our LinkedIn profiles as a badge of honor. The health costs, the burnout, the productivity lost at that next day meeting, nobody is calculating that ROI. Because the person who saved 15,000 rupees on the ticket gets a bonus. The person who shows up exhausted to a 2 crore deal negotiation just shows up exhausted. Here's the business case that Indian CHROs and CFOs need to hear. The cost of booking is not the ticket price. It's the ticket price plus the cost of everything that happens after that executive lands. Air India's Maharaja Club Business Class, Indigo's new international business product, and Vistara's award-winning cabin before its merger into Air India, the premium product exists domestically and internationally. The question is whether companies will ever be smart enough to use it strategically rather than grudgingly. I'll just fly Emirates. The most expensive self-delusion in Indian business travel. Yes. The great Indian business travelers escape hatch. Domestic airlines are terrible. I only fly international carriers when I can. Qatar Airways, Singapore Airlines, Lufthansa, Emirates, Etihad. Beautiful aircraft. Incredible service. Genuinely world-class in many cases. But here's what we conveniently forget, they are not playing the same game. Qatar Airways flying into Delhi or Mumbai is optimized for passengers connecting onward to Doha, London, and New York. Their operation, their cost structure, their service design, it's built for an international passenger paying 30 to 40% more than the equivalent domestic fare for a comparable distance. They come from hub and spoke systems where their home country's geography literally requires them to serve routes stretching far beyond their borders. They are built for intercontinental throughput. They don't compete on Mumbai to Delhi. They connect Mumbai to the world. That's a fundamentally different business. Holding them up as the standard Indian domestic carriers should meet is like demanding your neighborhood Udupi restaurant match the plating standards of Gagan. Different game, different economics, different everything. The more useful question is, why haven't Indian carriers with the scale, the routes, the customer base been allowed, incentivized, or forced to build something genuinely excellent within their actual operating constraints? And that answer, again, circles back to margins that don't allow investment in experience. Let's say the quiet part out loud. This is becoming a safety issue. I know this is where some people will get uncomfortable. Good. Stay uncomfortable for a moment. Chronic margin pressure in aviation does not just produce bad food and broken IFE screens. It produces conditions where safety compromises become economically rational decisions. Deferred maintenance. Crew fatigue from schedules designed around aircraft utilization rather than human biology. MRO contracts with Airworks HAECO or magnetic MRO negotiated down to the last rupee. Regulatory inspections that are technically passed but practically gaming the system. We have seen what happens when aviation safety culture erodes globally, not just in India. The Boeing 737 MAX story is partly a story about what happens when financial pressure overrides engineering judgment at every level of the supply chain. That's not an Indian problem exclusively. That's a human institutions problem. And Indian aviation is not immune to the same forces. DGCA has been working to strengthen oversight, increased audits, aircraft groundings on airworthiness concerns, and heightened scrutiny of SpiceJet's operational standards as recently as 2022 to 2023. That's the system working. But the system works better when the airlines it oversees aren't perpetually in financial crisis mode. A financially healthy airline is a safer airline. Not automatically. Not without strong regulation. But the correlation between financial distress and safety incidents is real, documented, and worth taking seriously. We brag about choosing Emirates over a domestic carrier for the extra 3 inches of legroom. We should be demanding a domestic aviation ecosystem healthy enough to be genuinely safe, because that affects every single flight we take, international connection or not. What actually needs to change, and what you can do about it. Alright. We've had the full conversation. Now what? Because here's the thing about LinkedIn and about industry conversations generally. It is very easy to generate 400 likes on a post about how broken Indian aviation is. It is much harder to actually move the needle. So let me be specific. If you're a corporate travel manager or CHRO, do the full ROI calculation on your business travel policy. Not just ticket cost. Factor in executive productivity, meeting outcomes, health and wellness claims data, and attrition numbers among your most traveled employees. Present that to your CFO. Track what changes. If you book your own travel, stop making the 50 rupees to 100 rupees fare difference the only decision criterion. Factor in on-time performance, safety record, and whether the airline you're choosing is actually a viable long-term business. Indigo's on-time performance on major routes is genuinely industry-leading. If you have a platform in industry, consultant, speaker, policy advisor, talk about the price flow question seriously and specifically. Not as a vague talking point, as a concrete policy position. FICCI's Aviation Working Group, CII's Transport Committee, the Ministry of Civil Aviation's consultation processes, these are real rooms where input from practitioners shapes actual policy. If you work in aviation professionally, airline, MRO, airport, ground handling, regulatory, push for transparency on safety audit outcomes. Advocate for compensation structures that don't punish engineers for flagging maintenance concerns. Speak up in the rooms where it matters, not just on LinkedIn. And if you're just someone who flies a lot, talk about this. Not to complain. To create the kind of public expectation that makes airlines and regulators uncomfortable enough to act differently. The landing. India has 1.4 billion people. A middle class boarding a flight for the first time in numbers that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. Geographic distances that make aviation not a luxury but a practical necessity for anyone serious about business or family. And an aviation sector being systematically pushed toward a race to the bottom by price-obsessed booking behavior, cost-obsessed HR travel policies, under-regulated competitive practices, and a government that controls the ceiling but ignores the floor. Akasa Air is trying to build something genuinely new with a young Boeing 737 MAX fleet and a clear low-cost model. Air India is midway through the most ambitious airline turnaround in recent Indian corporate history under the Tata Group. Indigo is aggressively expanding internationally with new wide-body aspirations. The ambition is real. The investment is real. But ambition without viable economics is just a press release. The question isn't whether Indian aviation needs to change. It clearly does. The question is whether you, sitting in that 5 a.m. check-in queue at Terminal 1 with your third coffee and your laptop bag and your economy boarding pass, are willing to be part of demanding something better. Or whether you're going to share this post with a fire emoji and then book the cheapest fare again tomorrow morning. Your call. So what needs to move first? Regulatory price floor, corporate travel policy reform, or a genuine cultural shift in how India values the flying experience? Tell me below. The conversation is open.